Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming today to our panel on poverty in California. My name is David Brady, and I direct the Blum Initiative on Global and Regional Poverty here at UC Riverside. And we're delighted to have you all here. And I'm just going to make a few brief remarks before getting us going. This event is part of the programming of the Blum Initiative, which is an institute dedicated to advancing our understanding of poverty in California, especially inland Southern California, as well as globally. And we do this through faculty and graduate student research, service, teaching, and academic and community events. The major staff include myself and Justine Ross, our associate director. We have lots of partnerships with local organizations like the Community Action Partners and the City of Riverside, as well as the Blum Centers across the state of California. And today's event is co-hosted by Golden State Opportunity, especially featuring Amy Everett. The major activities include programming and service learning. So we have programming. Last year, we had an event that focused on affordability in water. And in 2021, we're hoping to host our second Inland Empire Poverty Summit, if we can get it organized online. We also do a variety of service learning fellowships. So one of the biggest things we do is we send students anywhere in the world to do a poverty internship, and we turn an unpaid internship into a paid job so our students can go do it. We have a number of signature research projects. We have the Inland Empire Poverty Report that both Zach and Justine and I collaborated on in the past, and we should have another one out next year. We're currently working on what we call the California Neighborhood Socioeconomic Disadvantage Index that tells us for every neighborhood in California what the levels of socioeconomic disadvantage are. And we're also surveying all California state legislators on poverty as we speak. In today's event, we're going to focus on poverty in California. And I just want to highlight a couple of key reasons that we all should really care about poverty in California. First and foremost, we live here and we should seek to understand the inequalities in our communities and our state. Secondly, California is really big and it deserves our attention as much as many other countries deserve our attention. With 40 million people, California outranks most European countries. Now, beyond that, despite the fact that California has incredibly wealthy people in some of the richest areas of the world, California still appears to have remarkably high poverty once one factors in housing costs, as Zach will do today. California has a variety of unique social problems, especially regarding transportation and housing that make poverty unique here in California especially. Further, given the demographics of our state, California can uniquely help us understand poverty amongst certain groups such as Latino and Asian American peoples. California gives us a distinctive chance to scrutinize poverty amongst immigrant populations. And I would argue, and I often argue, that immigrants remain the most understudied population of poor people in America. Now, too often, when one is a scholar like I am in the poverty literature, the literature focuses too much on the Midwest and the Northeast. We have more than enough studies in New York City or Chicago, and we've neglected largely this part of the United States where a huge share of our population resides. And finally, but perhaps most importantly, given the politics of our state, where we have, relatively speaking, Democratic Party control and very strong labor unions, there should be accountability for those political actors who are supposedly committed to economic egalitarianism. So I'm delighted today to feature Zach Parolin in this panel. Zach works at the Center on Poverty and Social Policy at Columbia University. He received his PhD from the University of Antwerp in Belgium, an MSc from Oxford in England, and a BA from University of Missouri. He's also currently broadcasting for us from Finland. And moreover, if he's not global enough already, Zach will soon become a professor at the University of Bocconi in Milan, Italy. Zach has been in the New York Times several times. He was on CNN, and he's an author of a host of academic publications. He's also in the midst of writing a book with Jennifer Laird that's provisionally titled Poor State, Rich State, that is under contract with Oxford University Press. I'm also extremely fortunate. We're very privileged to have three terrific panelists with us. Amy Everett is here. She's the president of Golden State Opportunity, our co-host on this event. We also have Supervisor Manuel Perez from Riverside County's 4th District. And finally, we have Tony Simmons, who's the chief consultant at the California State Assembly Committee on Jobs, Economic Development, and the Economy, often referred to as the Assembly Jobs Committee, which is chaired by our local representative, Sabrina Cervantes. So now what we're going to do, our game plan is that Zach's going to give us a presentation of the trends and patterns in poverty in California. And after that relatively brief presentation, we're going to give each of the panelists 90 seconds to give us some responses. And then we're going to save most of our time for Q&A and discussion. And we'll use the Q&A feature in the broadcast. The Q&A feature is really key, not the chat box, okay? And if you're watching via live stream, you can also comment on the video directly, and we will try to monitor that as well. So I'm gonna turn it over to Zach and mute myself at this point, and we'll give Zach the stage.
Thanks so much, Dave, and thanks to all of you for being here today, and especially for giving attention to what is, of course, a particularly salient topic at the moment, unfortunately, and that's poverty in the United States. As Dave mentioned, my name is Zach Parolin, and I'm currently at the Center on Poverty and Social Policy at Columbia University. And today I'm going to present some work that we've done at the national level with my colleagues Megan Curran, Christopher Weimer, Jordan Masudibra, and Jane Waldfogel, focusing on projecting poverty rates throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. And of course, today I'm going to focus particularly on the case of California. We'll talk a little bit about the CARES Act that was passed in March, its effects on poverty rates in California in particular. We'll look at racial and ethnic divisions, differences in racial and ethnic poverty rates by age, and so on for California throughout the entirety of 2020 so far. So just to start with a little bit of background on why this type of work, these projections of poverty rates during the crisis, are necessary. The U.S. Census Bureau produces official estimates of poverty in the U.S., but they are released with a considerable lag. So actually, it was only 2 months ago now that the latest poverty estimates from the Census Bureau were released, and those were from the year 2019. And of course, 2019 currently feels like a lifetime ago. Official estimates for the year 2020 will not be available for another year. And so our team is trying to step in and use the best information we have available to project poverty rates throughout the crisis to understand the current socioeconomic conditions of families across the country and today in California. So we've had two primary objectives, which I'll talk about briefly before getting into some of the findings here. First, we want to provide a framework for producing monthly updates of poverty. And second, we want to understand how recent policy changes, the CARES Act in particular, has affected current rates of poverty. So I'm going to briefly elaborate on these two. When we talk about producing monthly updates of poverty, we're primarily using the Supplemental Poverty Measure, or SPM, framework. And for those who are unfamiliar with the SPM, there's a couple important things you should know. First, when we're measuring poverty, we're in short looking at whether a family's total resources is less than a given poverty threshold. When we talk about resources, we're including all income, whether from employment or transfer programs, such as cash assistance from TANF or SNAP benefits or benefits from the Earned Income Tax Credit, and so on. And in the SPM framework, we're also subtracting out-of-pocket medical expenses and work-related costs as well. Importantly, in the SPM framework, the threshold varies depending on family size, but also differences in living costs across geographic places. California, of course, has higher housing costs relative to the rest of the country. And so the poverty threshold is, in most parts of California, higher than the national average. In fact, the median poverty threshold for a two-parent, two-child family in California is around $35,880 per year, or $3,000 per month, again, higher than most of the rest of the country. And the second objective I mentioned before is understanding how policy changes affect current rates of poverty. I'm going to elaborate on the CARES Act and its income transfers here in a few slides. I'm just going to say one small thing about data and methods, and if anyone has questions regarding our methodological approach, I'm very much happy to return to this in the discussion time. But in short, we have two data files that we're working with. One on the left is called the Current Population Survey, Annual Social and Economic Supplement, that's the CPS-ASEC. This is only released once per year, but it has all that information we want about income, poverty status, of course, demographics, employment conditions, household composition for hundreds of thousands of residents across the US. But we also have a monthly CPS file, which is updated on a regular basis. The latest one is from October 2020. This has all the same demographic and employment information as that annual file, but updated every month. The only thing it doesn't have is that detailed poverty status or that income status that we want to be able to understand current patterns of poverty. So in short, what we're going to do is take all the things that these two data sets have in common, that's here in the green box, demographic information, household composition, employment, and we're going to use that to fill in what's missing in the monthly files. That's in the red box, and that's poverty status. And we use an approach called combined sample multiple imputation to do that. Two important notes when we talk about poverty in our current framework. We are projecting monthly poverty rates based on a family's monthly income. Now, that differs from the standard approach of measuring poverty based on annual income or how much you earned over the last 12 months. We're looking at what transfers or what sources of income came to your family in this particular month. There's pros and cons to this approach. We can talk about them. We've also looked at annual poverty rates in prior work, but this is the focus for today. A couple notes about the CARES Act, and then we will get into our findings here, looking at trends in poverty in California. The CARES Act was passed at the end of March at the federal level and included a couple major sources of income transfers to offset some of the income losses that millions of families across the country have experienced during this pandemic. The first set of policies relates to these expansions of unemployment benefits. We had that $600 a week bonus to unemployment benefits that, of course, expired at the end of July. The expansion of access in the PUA to individuals who might not ordinarily qualify for unemployment benefits, and an extension of the duration of unemployment benefit receipt as well. The second major income transfer were the stimulus checks, or also known as the earned income, the economic impact payments. And I just want to contextualize how large these transfer programs were from the CARES Act. So what we're looking at is, in the black bars, projected spending from the CBO on the two major CARES Act income transfers. The far left is the unemployment benefits, and the second one is the stimulus checks, compared to spending on income transfers for all other income transfer programs in 2019. And the point here is that these CARES Act transfers are absolutely massive. In fact, if you add them up, they're more than spending on the EITC, SNAP, SSI, unemployment benefits, TANF, all other income transfers combined from 2019. The point being that this was a massive policy package, as it should have been given the magnitude of the crisis. And as we'll see on this next slide, sure enough, it had some effect on poverty rates, not only nationally, but in California. So I'm going to spend my final few minutes on this slide. And so before I get into details, I just want to make sure we all understand exactly what we are looking at here. This is trends in monthly poverty rates in California before and after accounting for the CARES Act's income transfers. So on the x-axis, we have months going from January 2020 to October 2020. That's the latest month for which we have data right now. The y-axis is the monthly poverty rate. The solid black line is the poverty rate before taking the CARES Act income transfers into account. And the dashed gray line starting in March is the poverty rate after taking the income transfers into account. So we're going to walk through this month by month and really contextualize what's going on in California and the role of the CARES Act in particular. Starting with this pre-crisis period. So this is January, February, pre-pandemic. And what I want to emphasize here is that even prior to the pandemic, about 1 in every 5 Californians lived with a monthly income below the poverty threshold. Again, before the crisis. So even prior to the difficulties we've seen over the last several months, we know that many families across the country, and particularly in California, are facing economic hardship. In March, it's a funny month in our framework because this is when a lot of families receive their earned income tax credit. And in our framework, we're only counting income received during the given month. So a lot of families are receiving that EITC in March, and that explains the decline in the poverty rate for that month, down to 16.3%. The CARES Act was passed at The end of March, and the end of March is also when we started to see that increase in unemployment. But really, most of that shows up here in April. So in April, we see, before accounting for the CARES Act, the poverty rate in California jumped to about 25.4%, according to our projections. Importantly, this is after taking some of those extra EITC benefits into account. So some of the families claimed them in April instead of March. Without those EITC benefits, this number would be closer to 28 or 29%. But if you look at the bottom part of this for April, we can see the impact of the CARES Act right away. Taking the CARES Act into account, those stimulus checks and also the $600 per week unemployment benefits, the supplement to unemployment benefits, we see that the poverty rate actually fell in California to 16.6%. If you do the math, this suggests that the CARES Act lifted about 3.5 million Californians out of poverty during April alone. You fast forward to June, though, and we start to see that the gap between these two lines is narrowing a little bit. So in June, before taking the CARES Act into account, unemployment's still high. The poverty rate's around 26%. Most of the stimulus checks by now are already distributed, but that $600 per week unemployment supplement is still around. And as a result, we have a poverty rate of about 19%. A little bit higher than the prior months as the stimulus checks are gone, but still lower than the pre-crisis estimates. But now we fast forward to August. This is after that $600 per week unemployment bonus expired in California. And you see that gray line starts to tick up towards the solid black line. Even after taking what's left of the CARES Act into account, which is primarily the pandemic unemployment assistance benefits, the PUA, we project that the poverty rate was around 23.5%, not too much different than the pre-CARES Act poverty rate. And if we go to October, we see it's a similar story. Compared to September and August, the unemployment rate in October improved a little bit. That's why the solid black line is declining here. But still, you see the CARES Act has very little effect at this point. It's lifting about 600,000 out of poverty, but still that 22.3% is higher than the poverty rate in April and May, and certainly higher than the start of the crisis. We can quickly look at the effect of the CARES Act transfers by month. This is actually nationally, but it's very similar for California. The black lines here are the poverty reduction effect of the stimulus checks, and the gray lines are the poverty reduction effect of those CARES Act unemployment benefits. And this is, again, looking by month. And the point here is pretty simple, that in April and May, when a lot of those stimulus checks were distributed, sure enough, they had a notable effect on poverty rates. In April through July, when that $600 supplement to unemployment benefits was still around, we see that they had a pretty large effect on poverty rates. Of course, you fast forward to August when those benefits decline, and you see the CARES Act is now doing much less than it did before, very similar to what we saw in the prior figure. We can look at disparities by race and ethnicity. Here, it's probably easiest just to focus on October. And you see the reddish line at the very top, that's for Latino families. Close to 1 in every 3 Latino families in poverty at this time. About 26.5% of Black families in California in poverty. 20% of Asian families, again, higher than the rates back in January and February, and around 14.4% here for white families. You can also look by age group. So children is the line at the very top. You see a huge decrease in March. That's when a lot of families with children received their EITC benefits. But if you look at October, it's 28% of children in California living in poverty, according to our estimates, 22.6% of the retirement age population, and about 20% of the working age adults. So again, large disparities by age group. Are these estimates meaningful? Do they map on to other descriptors of poverty that we might care about? The short answer is yes. And there's 2 things I want to emphasize on this slide before I conclude. This is simply showing that monthly poverty estimates for each state, that's on the y-axis of these figures, goes hand in hand with levels of food insufficiency, as we see in the left figure, missed or delayed rent payments, as we see in the middle figure, and frequent anxiety. And this is all data from the Census Household Pulse Survey. You can see that our estimates of monthly poverty pretty much go hand in hand with these other sources of hardship or concern. In California in particular, there's two things I want you to take away from this. Number one, I probably should have mentioned this before, but California actually has the highest poverty rates in the nation when we use the SPM, again, largely due to the high housing costs. And you see that California is above all the other states in the y-axis, has the highest poverty rate, but doesn't necessarily have the highest food insufficiency. You can see places like Louisiana, Mississippi, Texas, Nevada, Alabama have higher rates of food insufficiency, and several other states have higher rates of missed or delayed rent payments. But again, situation not great either way in California. So let me conclude. In California, the monthly poverty rate, according to our estimates, increased to 23.8% from February to October 2020, even after taking the CARES Act's income transfers into account. Increases in monthly poverty rates were particularly acute for racial ethnic minorities, as well as for children. The CARES Act's stimulus checks and unemployment benefits lifted more than 3.5 million Californians out of monthly poverty in April, but this number fell to around 600,000 in October after the expiration of that $600 per week unemployment supplement. And finally, we can state this, that due to the expiration of those stimulus checks and the $600 per week supplement, the monthly poverty rate in October was actually higher than rates during April and May, despite the fact that the unemployment rate declined over that time and was also higher than pre-crisis levels. So I'll stop there and invite Dave back and just say thanks again for having me on.
Thank you, Zach. That's extremely informative. I'll turn it now to each of our panelists, and they're allocated a strictly limited 90 seconds. And then we'll open it to Q&A. Amy, why don't you go first? And then Tony.
Thank you. And thank you, Zach, for that really interesting data. So I have, if time permits, 3, maybe 4 points that I want to make. One is, Golden State Opportunity, we work to create financial security for low-income Californians. So this information is really helpful. And the fact that you're working on monthly data is ever more important, because that's how we can evaluate programs in real time. It's so unhelpful to evaluate a program a year after you've done it. So really looking forward to future monthly data. The second thing that really speaks to me about what you said is that direct payments, such as the stimulus payments and the unemployment, that put cash back in families' pockets, it really makes a difference. But they still weren't actually enough to offset the pandemic's impact. And what is clear to me is we need another round of stimulus last month and the month before, if not right now. The other thing that I found curious is that ITIN holders, undocumented folks who are working in California and across the country, are probably not caught up in this because none of these programs actually apply to them. So the poverty rates are probably worse to our most vulnerable. I'm really pleased that California is one of 2 states that's expanded the Cali ITC to include all ITIN holders for the 2020 tax year. It still won't be enough. And I think one of the really important points that that needs to be hammered home is that even during the downturn, and as you pointed out, before the downturn, we need policies that actually push families trying to get ahead. We need to have policies that support them and don't hinder them. And I think that a lot of times as we're making policies, we're forgetting about the children. There are more kids who are living in food insecure homes in LA and California than ever before. And until we have a federal program that can actually serve all of the vulnerable populations, poverty is going to be a never-ending challenge for us, with or without stimulus payments. But really, thank you for this information, and happy to be a part of the panel.
Okay. Tony, go ahead.
Well, thank you. So let me start by just saying that I appreciate everyone taking the time to do this kind of work. As Amy said, it's a tremendous advantage for policymakers, advocates, as well as community groups who are trying to address economic and the social fallout from the COVID-19 recession. I really have 3 top-level takeaways. First, as we were hearing about it, that California in the aggregate did not start in a very good place. 21% SPM is not very good for January 2020. And for African Americans, 25.7%, and Latinx, 29.2%. And remember, this is a time when California unemployment was officially being reported at 3.9%. So we can see a huge disparity there. So second, the data, I think, really illustrates the long-term impact of economic and social policies that either fed into or failed to extinguish systemic inequalities. Even with the interventions, as we heard, there's still a lot that needs to happen. And I think that there's been a lot of coverage in the news about the concentrated impact on individuals of colors, but I particularly personally had not seen as much about the impact on children. So I think that is a new piece that we're certainly going to be paying more attention to. And the third part is that the data also shows that public policy interventions were important. And I just wanted to add that the supplemental UI and the pandemic unemployment assistance actually it's been over $110 billion flowing through the economy of California. But obviously, there needs to be a lot more done. And I think this type of data is very helpful.
Manny?
Yes, thank you once again, everyone. And thank you for your presentation as well. As a policymaker, whether it be at the state level or the local level or the regional level, the data obviously is very important. And I appreciate the data that was presented today. Now, I represent a unique area, if you will, the 4th District, which is the entire Coachella Valley, as well as the Palo Verde Valley. It's around 5,000 square miles. It takes me about 2.5 hours to get from one end to the other. It's a huge district. But here in the area of the Coachella Valley, quite frankly, we have quite a bit of pockets of poverty that have existed for years, for decades, since I was a kid. Even though there's a narrative, there's a picture out there that the Coachella Valley is a playground for folks. And quite frankly, it is for those that have, and it's not for those that don't. The truth is that, as you talked about the immigrant population, for example, we have a very large immigrant population here, and not enough is being done for them. And we try to, through policy, through COVID dollars, by ensuring, for example, with farm workers, that the majority are immigrants, have access to at least some sort of funding if they actually contract the virus. And at the same time, implement a policy in which we're able to quarantine them if need be, so that they don't spread the virus to family members. But that's very unique. That doesn't happen all the time, and it doesn't happen throughout the state of California or throughout the US. And so I appreciate the data, because it's going to help us move forward with policies that are important when it comes to equity and economic justice. The other issue that I want to just bring up very quickly here, it's interesting to me that we're at a very high level throughout the state of California when it comes to poverty, but here in the Coachella Valley, approximately 50% of residents already are living below 200% federal poverty level. It's already very high here. It has been in the Coachella Valley. But once again, I think that through these presentations, through this education, I can work with colleagues like Tony Simons, like Amy, like yourself, Zach, David, others, so that we can implement sound policy that's going to lift people and provide them an opportunity, an equal opportunity to advance themselves and their families.
Thank you to all three of the panelists. It's really genuinely an honor to be in such an intellectually rigorous discussion. I really appreciate it. I'm going to give Zach a couple minutes to respond to those comments to the extent he wishes to. And then I want to again encourage the audience to populate the Q&A box with your questions. So send your questions there. We'll work through those. And so I'll briefly let Zach respond, and then we'll go to the audience. And then we'll also, please also encourage the panelists to respond or direct your questions to them as well, along with Zach. Go ahead, Zach.
Thanks, Dave, and thanks to each of you for the comments as well. I think I'll make two brief points to reflect on some of your thoughts before we turn to the Q&A. One is on what was brought up about particularly high levels of poverty among immigrants, and in particular undocumented communities in California. What was particularly cruel about the CARES Act is that if you had even one undocumented resident in your household, in your family unit, you could not receive the stimulus checks that were distributed back in the spring. Even if, say, you were born in the United States, you're a citizen, but maybe your mother or father is not, you're locked out of those stimulus checks for honestly no good reason. And we know that that's hurt a lot of immigrant communities in particular, not receiving the same type of income support that most of the other families across this country received back in the spring. We know similarly, there's been greater barriers put up to receive unemployment benefits and that $600 a week bonus in particular. It's cruel, and it's, of course, it's hard to measure precisely the poverty rates among the immigrant community in our data set, but we know it's much higher than the rest of the state, perhaps upwards of closer to 30% for some of these estimates that we're looking at, and it doesn't need to be that way. The second point I'll make just kind of builds on what Tony and Supervisor Perez and Amy also mentioned, is that even at baseline, even back before the start of the pandemic, to see poverty rates around 20% and even higher for racial and ethnic minorities in a state like California is simply way too high. That we had a problem with the welfare state in the United States prior to the crisis. If we had, for example, a child allowance, like most of our peer countries had in the US, either at the federal level or the state level, we know that those high child poverty rates we saw would be much lower. And I just emphasize this to point out that, yes, the challenges we face now are particularly acute, but it's important to remember that many families in California and across the country were struggling before the start of the pandemic, and many more will also be struggling after this is over. And we can't forget to make sure that we're doing what we can to take care of them.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and start feeding questions to the panel. And the first question comes from Jackie Botts, who's coming to us from Cal Matters. And her question is, as the California legislative session opens, what types of bills should lawmakers prioritize to ensure an equitable recovery? Please be specific.
Would you like me to at least
Sure,
take some
go
of that?
for it. Yeah.
We have looked at this relative to poverty specific as well as the broader overall economic recovery. And so a few things that I think are being discussed, and that is, how can the California State Legislature impact the transition to the new president as well as the stimulus discussions. So I think you're going to see a lot more active California legislature in that way. The other is, there are discussions about, can we subsidize some of the food assistance benefits for low-income residents? California actually, during the early times of the COVID-19 crisis, we did do a supplemental food program. California, of course, can have nothing as compared to the big USDA programs, which were literally billions and billions of dollars. But we did do an added food program. We've also been focusing on subsidized childcare for essential workers, and we've even seen some pilots. Long Beach Local Workforce Development Board, as an example, is doing a platform that does workforce training so we know we have qualified childcare providers. They then created a spin-off nonprofit so that the workers would have a full-time employer of record. So we're talking about benefits, et cetera, and that essential workers can use the platform to do hourly work. So you kind of get the middle ground on that. That's now a Long Beach Workforce Board activity. That there are discussions going on raising that up. We're also looking at issues of modification of the work share program, which is supposed to be allowing, as workers' hours go down, this is an existing program in California, that unemployment would fill up that gap. There's discussions about whether that could be flipped. And so as small businesses particularly bring workers on but can't do full-time, can they still have portions of unemployment? These are all still in the discussion stages, and there's more, but I think that gives you a flavor.
I'd like to maybe, if I can, chime in a bit here, just as an individual that once sat as the chair of the Jobs Committee working with Tony Simon and with other legislators throughout the state of California. I appreciate the point that was just made about ensuring that there is funding for childcare. I think that is essential. If we truly are talking about getting families out of poverty, we need to make sure that families, the parents that are working, have a place that's safe, that's of quality, that educates children at a young age, younger than we're used to. Like when I went to school, I started going to school maybe at 5 years old. We're talking about maybe now educating children as soon as possible, right? And having a quality childcare provider and ensuring that the funds are there so that people can go to work, especially essential workers, whether it's a grocery store worker or whether it's a farm worker or someone that's in construction. It doesn't matter to me. The point is that ultimately we need to make sure at the state level that that funding is there moving forward. I also want to put in the plug right now since we're having this discussion, and I'm very happy to see that my colleague, Eduardo Garcia, out of the 56th Assembly District, introduced legislation alongside other colleagues to deal and advance the work around the digital divide. We need to make sure that all our kids, all our youth have access to education that's of quality. And COVID has had a major impact on all our youth and especially communities of color. And so this is an equity issue, and that is an issue, in my opinion, of civil rights. We need to make sure that we do everything possible to pass legislation so that we have the funding necessary so we can deal with the gaps that we have when it comes to the digital divide. And just one last thing I want to say. We need to diversify the economy. And the way we diversify the economy, especially in impoverished areas, we need to make sure that people have access to education, higher education, right? And so ensuring that people have access to the Cal States, to the universities, and having those funds available for them to go on to higher education. And with that being said, maybe even for those individuals that don't want to pursue higher education, that we have funding for workforce, that we have funding for so that people can transition into jobs that are going to pay them a fair wage, a decent wage, a wage in which they can take care of themselves and their families and their communities as a whole. Just want to put in those plugs, and hopefully someone in the legislature is hearing me out right now. And obviously, Tony, I'm sure will bring that up later to our friends up there.
Could I say, I'm going to direct the question, make sure Zach responds on the question of policy recommendations. And in addition to state legislative issues, are there national policy recommendations that may need to go with these state legislative issues?
Absolutely. There's two simple and well, maybe not simple, but two major things that Congress could do at the federal level right now to reduce levels of poverty and hardship as well. The first should have been done a long time ago. It's expanding the maximum benefit value for SNAP or food stamps by at least 15%, which was done back in the Great Recession, but has not been done during this crisis. Of course, states have upgraded benefit levels to the maximum for those not already receiving it, but that maximum hasn't been increased as it was during the last crisis. That would be one way with precedent to put more income into the pockets of families right now. The second, of course, is to get another income support bill passed in Congress. There's discussions ongoing about renewing some of those PUC benefits, that $600 a week supplement, even if it's at a lower level, perhaps new stimulus checks, whatever it looks like. Well, there's better ways, of course, but regardless, the point is they need to get more money into the hands of families right now. We saw, in the presentation, after that $600 a week supplement expired, poverty rates increased. And if we want to reduce poverty, we know what we need to do right now.
Okay, I'm directed to Amy. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Jackie, for this really important question. At the state level, I think anything that gets more cash into the hands of people who need it is going to be the most effective way to beat poverty. When you have more cash, you can afford food, you can afford housing, you can afford the internet. So any sort of cash transfer programs, I think, are going to be critical. Here in the state of California, I think we should also be looking at expanding the EITC, the Cal EITC yet again. It is the largest transfer of money into vulnerable populations, particularly communities of color. And it has the added incentive of actually being an anti-recessionary. We released a report last year, I guess it was actually earlier this year, that actually demonstrates that with the EITC, it's actually a job creator and a job sustainer and puts more money back into local sales tax and the general fund. At the federal level, I think one of the most immediate and important things we can do is apply a national look back. And what that means is the ability for people who have lost so much income in 2020 to use the 2019 year tax basis to apply for things like the EITC. Because so many people have lost income, they don't even qualify to access the federal or state EITC anymore. So I think we need a federal look back, as well as the continued expansion of the earned income tax credit at the federal level. We already have the systems in place to get cash to people, as we saw with some of Zach's slides. When people receive that money in March and April, it makes a huge bump. We're trying to figure out ways to make sure that bump works all year long, but at least at that one period in time, there's a lot more financial security for folks to make better decisions and afford life's basic needs. So those are my recommendations about where we need to go, and we're getting ready to go pursue them.
Okay. All right, I'm going to ask a couple in the weeds data questions. I'm consolidating questions across them so we get to these. So the data issues, one, can we do this? I know the answer to some of these, Zach. Can we do this at the local level? Can we do monthly poverty rates at the local level, just in the IE? Secondly, how is the coverage in the census and this data set you're using of especially undocumented folks that may or may not be collected by the data? And related to that, do you have any thoughts on this trade-off? We're going to monthly income, but that almost kind of presumes that people can't spill over resources from month to month. So could you hit some of those data issues, Zach?
Yep, sure. So on the first part, can we get to a more local level than the state? Could we get to the county or even the municipal level in California, for example? The short answer is it depends on population sizes. So the problem is when we get narrower and narrower in this data set, we have fewer individuals actually in the data set from these areas. And so we lose confidence in our estimates. And so generally at the state level and the data we're working with is the most comfortable level of unit of analysis we're generally going to. Unfortunately, we don't have great indicators on documentation status in the CPS that we're working with. We have done some work in this data set to try to impute or estimate who is likely to be undocumented among the immigrant community to, of course, decide in our data set who gets these benefits and who doesn't, but it's not perfect. And so that's part of the reason why I didn't present numbers for the undocumented community today. And third, you're absolutely right that there are trade-offs when looking at monthly income and monthly poverty versus annual income and annual poverty. The monthly framework is useful because it more appropriately captures that intra-year volatility that families are experiencing right now. But it does have some disadvantages, and the obvious one is that many families, if they receive those unemployment benefits, they have some extra savings, they're able to use that to smooth their consumption over future months. And so even if they don't necessarily have it in August, maybe they're still using those payments they received in July to support themselves. So that's part of the trade-offs involved with this measure, and we do touch on that more in our paper if anyone's interested in reading that.
Okay, I have a question from Jiang Park from the Sacramento Bee. And let's first give this to Zach and then also back to the panelists to respond on this issue. Her question is, what explains the big dip relative to others in SPM rate in March for the Hispanic community? Also, what will be the effect of things like PUA, PEUC, paid leave, eviction moratorium, all running out by December 31st? That's a lot, but do your best.
Yeah, the first answer is it's largely about the earned income tax credit having a disproportionate effect on lower income communities in March. And that's why you see that dip that we saw, because that's when a lot of these families, lower income families, are receiving those EITC benefits. The expiration of the rest of these CARES Act transfers and at the end of this month is it's not going to be pretty. We've done some poverty simulations. We're looking certainly at higher poverty rates in January than we see in December, even if we see massive gains in employment rates, because these benefits are now being taken away. And income poverty is one thing, but you brought up the eviction moratoriums. I mean, it doesn't necessarily show up in our poverty data, but of course it massively affects families' lives. Needless to say, it's quite urgent that Congress do something this month to make sure that these programs don't expire in full the day after Christmas.
Okay, yeah, we'll go Amy, Tony, and Manny. If you want, sorry, put you on the spot.
Yeah, I don't think that, in the data, I think the most important thing that we're looking at as an anti-poverty group is that idea of how do we create financial security 12 months out of every year. And that is the difficult thing. It is the debate for us is when you get the EITC, and some folks between the California and the federal one can get up to $8,000, although the median is much lower. That's a chance to put down a first and last month's rent. And then they can afford monthly rent. It's a time to fix your car. But those are one-time inflections of income and security. And how do we build that out for the rest of the year? That's our big challenge.
Okay, Tony?
Yeah, I would say that the just talking about the deadline runoff, I think, as I mentioned before, I think that the members of the legislature are aware of that. And that's why you don't always see the legislature engaging on federal policy in public ways. But I think you're going to see a real push, as well as you've already seen from stakeholder groups, about the need for addressing that. At the state level, the governor is aware that these things are coming due. And I think, as you can see from the early days in the pandemic, that he's willing to respond. I can't talk in detail because it'd be inappropriate. What I can say is that the governor is already and has continued, but it's really stepped up in the last several weeks relative to engaging with Assembly and Senate leadership. The governor's proposal a week ago about the $500 million in grants for small businesses, that came as there was a growing awareness of the very severe situation in ICU units. The governor anticipated needing to make some pretty severe stay-at-home orders. And anticipation of that, he engaged directly with not only Assembly and Senate leadership, budget staff. My chair was asked. So I think you're going to see, to the extent that the state has tools, you're going to see the state trying to at least backlash and back up and mitigate some of the really significant impacts. But people are aware.
Annie?
So there's a lot there. Obviously, poverty is high, as you already discussed, in the state of California. We know that already, but let me just talk about the 4th District once again in the Coachella Valley, the Pajaro Valley area. Although that's the case, in the Coachella Valley, our poverty rate is 10 points higher than the state of California at 46.5%, right? And then when you talk about communities of color, in the Coachella Valley, the population is around 50%, 3 times more likely to face poverty than white residents. And so I got those stats, that information from an organization. I'm going to put in a plug here for an organization called Live to Rise. And what Live to Rise, and it's based here out of Palm Desert, California, working with higher education institutions and working with other nonprofits to make sure that folks are educated on the ground level around the needs and concerns that folks have out here when it comes to poverty, working with policymakers like myself and providing me the data, policy points for me to push an agenda. Quite frankly, the issue of rent burden is very real. Right. And that's one of the areas that they are tackling. And as a matter of fact, in the Coachella Valley, 60% of households pay more than 30% of their income on rent. And that's higher than the state of California by 2.1 percentage points. And so when those numbers are coming at us and they're letting me know about this, then it's also telling me that I need to do everything possible to advocate at the federal level for another CARES Act fund to come our way. And at the same time, when we do receive those funds from the state coming into the county, then we need to do our best to ensure that we provide those CARES Act dollars for folks that are rent burdened. And we need to provide that rental relief for those individuals because we need financial stability at the end of the day for all our folks. And with that being said, when we talk about the immigrant population as well, because of the barriers that do exist there, I'm gonna put another plug here for those that may be watching at the federal level. We need comprehensive immigration reform. Bottom line at the end of the day, right? And so by doing that, then we'll be able to ensure that we have a wider safety net, a wider amount of programs and services that we can provide to folks that really need them, that quite frankly are working every single day, helping this economy move. And if it wasn't for these individuals that are undocumented, we ourselves that are documented perhaps wouldn't have a job, would be able to go to work, because these are the folks that are cleaning our homes. These are the folks that are taking care of our kids. These are the folks that are taking care of our elderly. And these are the folks that are also picking the fruits and vegetables that we eat in our homes.
I'll give Zach 30 seconds to, if you want to follow up, you don't have to, but just to make sure you have the opportunity to do so.
No, I think that's perfectly put.
Well
but
said.
so nothing more from me.
Okay. All right. So we have a number of specific policy questions that we've been asked, and we're going to have a few more. But let me ask a big picture policy question that I got from both Chris Castorina and Adam Nicholson. Chris Castorina mentions the AB 2712, which is a universal basic income proposal in the California state legislature. Adam more broadly asks about, there's this classic debate between more universal social policies that aim to reach everybody versus targeted social policies that focus and concentrate on the most vulnerable. And given the concerns about immigrants and other particularly vulnerable groups, how can we reflect on this big classic question of universal versus targeted social policy in this context?
Well, okay, that's a tough one. That's how do you balance that, right? It's always a concern, right? When I think about at a state level, we are there to work on policy for the state of California as a whole, working with both Democrats and Republicans to try to get something done. But at the same time, as a representative for a specific district, we also have our own issues and agendas that we need to try to work through. Same thing at this point right now, as I'm thinking about the Board of Supervisors, the County of Riverside as a whole. I have to work with my colleagues or others, try to make sure that we implement policy and provide the resources, the programs that are necessary for everyone. But in the 4th district, I believe that I have quite a bit of need that is very unique, and that I would rather target more resources, and I'd rather target more programs, and I'd rather target certain populations like the undocumented. To just in a general way, it's about having a balance, I guess, and that's hard. It's very difficult as a policymaker. But with that being said, I'm going to obviously do what I can to support all communities. But as a Latino growing up in the Coachella Valley, the son of immigrant farm workers, my heart is going to definitely be where I think the need is, and that is with those populations.
Any others?
I think it's a false choice. I think that if we keep things in that dichotomy of we help everybody or we help a few, we're not going to really be able to help anybody. I think what we need to figure out is how do we create policy solutions that don't make people feel like other people are getting ahead at their expense, but that it's actually a way for everybody to be lifted up. And an example, especially for the 4th district supervisor, is, if we're able to increase universally the minimum wage, I know we have in California, but I'm using that as an example. The minimum wage of $15 means one thing in the Bay Area and a vastly different thing in Riverside. And San Bernardino, and it should. I mean, that is a way of making sure that there are additional resources given to the most needy, because the cost of living there is so much lower than it is in Alameda or in Los Angeles, in South Central Los Angeles. So I think that what we need to find is get away from the dichotomy of pitting one against the other, and just find how do we raise all boats and get rid of this idea that it's a zero-sum game, that if somebody gets something, somebody else is losing. We're all gaining. To your point, Supervisor, we're all gain when immigrants in America and California are able to have good health care and access to the resources that they need, because they are the reason other people can go to work.
That's correct.
And so it's not I think we need to move away from the competitive language of resources and look at actually aspirationally, who do we want to be as a society, and aim for that.
Tony, any comment? Or Zach? I'll come back to Zach.
I would just add that I think that there's a lot of research. It's been done at the international as well as in the domestic level that really shows that income inequality is a drag on the overall economy. And so when you're trying to create robust communities and neighborhood level economies, everybody needs to have the funding in order to fully participate. I think one of the things that is specifically unique about the COVID-19 recession is that it's highly concentrated within certain subgroups. And I think that could be a way that policymakers that vote, I don't vote, I provide background and discuss things with members, but I do think, considering the very concentrated impacts, that if you did a needs base that was trying to get to a more overall equitable society, so that we've got small businesses moving forward, you could come up with policies that were more targeted.
Zach?
Yeah, I think these are all great points and they're great questions as well. I guess the one thing I'll say about universalism is that if we're going to have these income transfers that are quote unquote universal, then they should in fact be universal. So if we have universal stimulus payments, then they shouldn't discriminate based on documentation status. I don't know much about proposals in California or elsewhere, but if we ever get to some basic income, if that's what somebody of Congress people passes at some level, then it should indeed be universal and actually cover everyone. And we can, again, do both at the same time, targeting within universalism, make sure everyone's covered, and at the same time recognize that some groups are historically more disadvantaged than others and probably need a little bit of extra income support to just get to the same place that everyone else is at. So I think they're great questions, and that's my 2 cents on it.
Okay, I'm going to raise very briefly, two specific policy issues raised in the Q&A, and also ask the audience, you have like the windows closing on posting your questions. Okay, so one questioner asked about reducing public court-ordered debt as a specific policy issue in California, especially given many Californians face wage garnishments. Another questioner raised issues about how serious is the problems of evictions? What can we monitor? Do we know what sorts of evictions we're looking at in the near term? Either of those to any of the panelists.
I would start. I don't have any expertise on court-ordered debt area. What I will say on the area of evictions, our committee does a lot of work around small businesses, and so I can address it from that standpoint. One of the things that the state has done is they've funded small business development centers, women's development centers, minority business development centers, to name, and veteran centers, to actually work one-on-one with small businesses on getting their leases revised. I have heard through NPR that there are local governments in the Bay Area. I live in Northern California, so I don't know what's going on in Southern California, but local governments in Northern California have been putting out grant dollars so that there is a place where tenants can work one-on-one to get lease and rental agreements modified. So I think it's a very, very important issue. It's one that is, I'm not sure, scalable, simply waving your wand, but I think that there needs to be effort there, and I think we have a number of areas where this is being worked on.
Other reactions?
Okay. I would add that, like Tony, I don't know much about court-ordered payments. I think some are probably really important and others are just punitive. But I do think an area that we need to focus on is predatory lending. I think that in low-income communities, especially, their access to mainstream credit is limited, and it creates a cycle of debt. It creates a debt trap that is really hard to get out of. When we talk to people about what they do with their EITC refunds, a majority of them talk about paying off their debts, whether it's credit cards or payday loans or old car loans. I think if we can solve the predatory debt problem, we can solve a big chunk of why people aren't able to get ahead when they're working as hard as they are.
All right.
I agree
Go
with
ahead.
both my colleagues here. Financial stability is important. Housing stability is critical. Access to capital, that's not in any form that's predatory. Obviously, I agree with that. And as far as the small business community is concerned, I'm very proud of the fact that we did provide through the CARES Act dollars funding for those folks so that, they weren't evicted, if you will, from their commercial lease in the amount of almost $50 million, right? And we helped quite a bit of businesses, but that's not enough. When I talked about rental relief earlier, so those folks are not evicted. We provided almost $35 million. And I think we're going to try to do a little bit more these last few days, but that's not enough, right? And so it's a tough one, but I definitely know at the federal level, I'm hoping that there is another set of CARES Act dollars that's going to help us. And at the same time, once again, we do our best here locally to improve, be more efficient, data-driven, working with and collaborating with nonprofit organizations, once again, so that we can get to the folks that really need the resources and the programs on the ground.
Okay. I'm going to give, unless the panelists need to say something, I'll just give this to the last question to Monica Santana from Community Action Partners, one of our closest local partners that's housed a whole bunch of student interns here from the UCR School of Public Policy. So she writes, is there anything in the works to extend the moratorium and or provide additional assistance for utilities? A large amount of households in California are facing disconnections once the moratorium is lifted. What is the plan to handle this? Any panelists can speak to that.
We do have a program through the County of Riverside, for example, called CAP, in which there is a certain amount of funds. I don't exactly know how much that is for utility assistance. There is conversation taking place right now as well, for example, between the County of Riverside and Imperial Irrigation District, which is based out of Imperial County. However, 60% of energy that they provide are from the Coachella Valley, right? And so discussions are taking place there so that we're hoping that with new funds that are coming to the CARES Act eventually, that we're going to be able to provide assistance to those folks so they can pay off that utility, because we have people that are months behind, as you know, and paying off their utility when it comes to energy. And quite frankly, IID, Imperial Irrigation District, can't continue this way, and they're going to have a tough time later providing that energy. So my hope is that we'll be able to provide that resource later, that fund, working in collaboration with IID. But once again, we need CARES Act dollars coming from the federal government.
Tony, Amy, or Zach?
I'll just add that it's such a great question. But so often we do focus on housing costs and eviction, but utility shutoffs are much more common than I think a lot of us realize, and of course have massive physical and psychological effects on the families whose utilities are being shut off. So I wish I could say that this thing is being done at the federal level to stop this, but I'll simply note that it's such an important question and such an important facet of poverty and low income status to focus on. So let's hope for an extension of the eviction moratorium at the federal level and more support for families so we see fewer utility shutoffs moving forward.
Put the public in public utilities.
Definitely. Okay, on that note, I'll give the panelists 15 seconds if you want to make any concluding remarks, because we're over time already. And I want to make sure we stay roughly on schedule. Any last remarks from our panelists or from Zach?
Not much. We've seen that the CARES Act was massively successful in reducing poverty rates in the depths of this crisis. We need a CARES Act 2.0 if we want to see poverty rates fall from here on out.
Okay.
I'd extend that and say, not only do we need the CARES Act 2.0, we actually just need better public policy making to end poverty, because the CARES Act is just a point in time of a situation that was already horrendous. So we need to figure out the best policies with or without with the CARES Act, and then in addition for the long term.
Okay.
I would agree. I think the issues around equity and economic justice are so important, and unfortunately, or fortunately, I think the COVID-19 recession has really brought them to the forefront. It's now up to all of us as community members as well as public policymakers to leverage this into a really broad-based poverty mitigation movement.
Let me just say thank you, Tony, Amy, David, Zach, for the good work that you do on an ongoing basis. Thank you, UCR School of Public Policy as well. My alma mater, UC Riverside, proud graduate, 1995. Appreciate you all. And, you know, I learned a lot today. I'll say that, and just keep providing the data. And don't be afraid to give me a call to give me an idea. By all means, there's a lot of work that we need to do. And quite frankly, as a policymaker, one thing that I can do that I'm working on here at the local level when it comes to budgets, you know, when you have 60 to 70% of your budget going all towards public safety, which I know we need to have public safety, we got to think about the other side of that coin, right? We got to have some balance. And so I think that's where we also got to think about the safety net services and programs that are needed in our communities. So just want to put that out there. Thank you all.
Thank you. I want to just thank two groups, one, the panelists, and Zach for doing a wonderful job, very intellectually serious discussion on an important issue. Also want to thank my colleagues at the School of Public Policy at UCR, especially the staff members that organize all these events. So thank you to everyone that attended, and please stay in touch. We'll have future events, and best wishes to you all.